Recording in progress.
Well, good morning. My name is Scott Belcher, and I am the Executive Director of the ACES Mobility Coalition. Thank you for joining this morning. I'm going to kind of talk a little bit while people sign up. But so the ACES Mobility Coalition, it was created a year ago by public agencies who were interested in making sure that there was a path for first and last mile autonomous electric vehicles. So we represent both the public and the private sector. We have 24 members, and our primary goals are to promote safety, accessibility, sustainability, and workforce. And so today we have a great panel, which are the building blocks for a successful electric, autonomous, connected, and shared, or ACES deployment. And we have three really diverse and interesting speakers. The first will be Joe Moy, who's the CEO of Beep, which is an autonomous vehicle operator. The second will be Matt Colvin, who is the Chief of Staff for the Transportation Trade Department of the AFL-CIO, which represents, I think, almost 40 transportation trade unions. And then finally, we'll have Mike Freeberg, who is a partner at Holland & Knight and also the general counsel of the ACES Mobility Coalition. So with that, I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves, their organization, what they do in this space, and why this is important to them. And I'm going to start with Joe Moy.
Hey, Scott, and thanks for that. And Matt and Mike, good to see you out there. Beep specializes in the deployment of autonomous electric shared shuttle products in support of the proving out of use cases in first mile, last mile scenarios for both public and private transit across the U.S. So we've been in business for 6 years, working very closely with the U.S. Department of Transportation and NHTSA specifically in advancing these technologies and really building a roadmap for future platforms that will ultimately enable us to deploy these at scale across those scenarios. So appreciate the opportunity to be here. And Scott, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay. Matt, can you give a little bit of background on yourself and what you do?
Yeah. So I'm Matt Colvin. The transportation trades, we represent 37 unions across nearly every mode of transportation. And have been, I think really in the last 6 years, more focused on this issue in a, not having our heads in the sand, sort of, hell no to new tech way, but trying to be proactive partners in how to develop this and how to do it in a way that keeps workers centered in the conversation. And I think, we have generally looked at this from a workforce perspective, what displacing effects it may have and what opportunities it may create. I do think first last mile is like a use case where there could be real opportunities to build partnerships with labor unions. But we are also now, I think, because of what's going on in what has been going on in San Francisco, also really looking at it from a workforce safety perspective, since there have been incidents involving unions that we represent, including firefighters, letter carriers, transit. So, we're looking at it from a broad perspective. I think, though we for the most part, I think our unions that we represent are open to figuring this out, as long as the partnership is structured in a way that feels real to us and ensures that their voice is actually heard.
Great. Well, Matt, we appreciate the support you guys have you all have given us so far, and the openness. That's really important, and we really want to we value that that dialogue and hopefully that partnership. And next is Mike Freeberg.
Thanks, Scott. I've been at Holland Knight for about 9 years, and I got into space. Holland Knight is one of the largest transportation lobby shop in the country, because we represent a lot of transit entities, and then we do the private side as well. So got involved in this when RTC of Southern Nevada and JTA applied and won a build grant to do this, and it's been very illuminating and challenging to try to get that to fruition. What I'm really excited about of this webinar is actually having Matt and Joe from industry and labor, because you really need both sides to be rowing in the same direction, or as you see for a lot of transportation issues, it just dies on the vine. So that's where I'm excited about kind of the next couple of years.
Great. Well, thank you. So you can see why this is such a great panel. We've got the political side, we've got the labor side, and we've got the operational side. So those are three key elements for anybody who's contemplating deploying autonomous vehicles. So we're going to go into, we're not going to do slides, and we're going to actually have a dialogue, and we will take questions as they come up. So if you want to be part of the discussion, we welcome that. And so please do engage. So I'm going to start with you, Joe. So you've been in business for 6 years. You're an operator. So you come in and basically, do everything from the get-go, from mapping out the routes, from getting the permits, to engaging labor, to engaging first responders, to educating the community. Can you talk about kind of what those basic building blocks that are necessary for successful deployment, and also what lessons you've learned along the way? Because I know each deployment is different, but I'm sure there are some lessons that are applicable across deployments.
Yeah, Scott, I'm happy to. We've done now across 9 states over 50 different public road use cases, ranging from national parks to downtown urban areas to campus environments. And so, and each one of those has come with a different learning experience. Before I dive into the specific question, I'd love to come back to a comment Matt made, because I think it's a really important part of this dialogue, which is looking at autonomous platforms and solving for, microtransit deserts that exist across our country is a really, really important objective to accomplish a number of key goals. First of which is extending mobility and accessibility in these key areas of our country that lack alternatives. But also reactivating public transit. 50%, almost 50% of the people in our country don't have easy access to public transit. So really important, I think, for people to understand that in a lot of ways, these are new arterial services that are really underserved today in a lot of our transportation networks out there. I think back to kind of the question about experience and lessons learned and the building blocks for these successful deployments, which are all very much in test and pilot phases today. Frankly, in the next couple of years, we're advancing some exciting new partnerships that are going to allow us to industrialize this and scale this at a level that will truly be able to operate in the SAE level 4 scenarios. But I still think the the tenets to the successful pilots and test programs will apply long term in how we ultimately deploy and utilize these vehicles across our country. I mean, first and foremost, there's education involved. Like with any new technology, there's going to be groups that are apprehensive, even though we're a very, technology savvy country, especially in the younger population. The reality of it is people need to understand how it works, how they interface with it, how are they going to be able to have a safe, quality experience in riding these platforms. And so I really would emphasize kind of the education side of this and the role that has to be played by groups like ACES and ourselves and others in industry to continually focus on that. Regulatory partnerships are absolutely key. I mentioned the work that we've done with NHTSA and DOT, but you've also got to look at the regulatory environments at the individual states and even some at the local levels. And so, really participating in that process proactively has been a real key ingredient to our success, and frankly, I think a lot of what the future holds. And maybe a little bit of an offshoot of education, I would talk about community engagement and stakeholder engagement. And Matt hit on this. This isn't we've got to find partnerships, whether that's with the labor teams, whether that's with the disability groups or some of the underserved areas that we're trying to extend services to. They need to be part of the solution. And so early engagement and often engagement is something that I would say is very critical and will remain to be critical as we go forward. And then the last thing I'd maybe comment on is, especially as it relates to how we ultimately create adoption long term, and that's impactful use cases. This is about, yes, testing technologies and integrating it into legacy transit environments, but it's also equally as important that we are truly showing incremental ridership and some of this connectivity that I talked about with public transit. And so, as I like to say, this isn't about, taking a vehicle, going a mile and high-fiving because everything worked well. This is about moving people and providing extended mobility and accessibility services. And you really need to look at those areas where you can have the biggest impact early on. So hopefully that kind of gives you a sense from my seat in the stands.
Yeah, Joe, let me just ask you a couple of just quick follow-up questions to what you just said. One of the groups I know you do some work with, so it'd be really helpful if you address it because it is super important, is you do reach out to and do education with first responders, because responding to a situation with an electric autonomous vehicle can be different. And so you need to make sure that the community first responders know what to do. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, happy to, and a great point. I'm glad you brought it up because that's a really important component of, not only the successful and safe deployments of these vehicles, but also the whole area of adoption and people feeling comfortable using these platforms is knowing that you've gone through a process to ready our first responders and other key stakeholders for how you interact with these vehicles on our roadways. It's something we pioneered actually with the Jacksonville Transportation Authority 4.5 years ago, where we felt it was important in any launch to have a training event where we brought in police, fire, and rescue and took them through the operations of the vehicle. How do you access the power systems if it needs to be disconnected? How do you enter the vehicle? How do you manually operate the vehicle? And it serves two really important purposes in my mind. One is, the obvious of readying them in the event it's ever needed to be able to interface with those vehicles safely and properly. And secondly is, I think it's a really important thing for our communities to see that the first responders are embracing this and are, part of the overall deployment and process. So, that's been a really, really key component of success. You know, I'd give you a little bit of a sidebar, which was a fascinating level of training that we were able to do, and this was originally with the Florida Highway Patrol. And if you think about what the future holds, you know, today if you have a traffic investigation, you know, somebody goes out to the scene and they're trained to take eyewitness testimony and, you know, measure tire tracks in roadways and recreate an accident scenario. Well, in the future, you know, you'll have data logs that need to be analyzed. You'll have the perfect eyewitness from video testimony. It's going to be a very different level of research that has to happen. And, you know, in the example of the Florida Highway Patrol, they were very proactive about saying, hey, what does my workforce of the future have to look like? And what type of skills do we need to prepare them with to be able to deal with this, you know, expanded use of technology on our roadways? So a lot of really, really important things around the whole educational arena that I'd say are critical and are going to continue to be for the long term.
I'm going to want to dig into the workforce in a minute. I have one kind of last question. So
you got a couple other panelists on here. I just want to remind you.
I'm going to set up this question, so don't worry, Joe. I have a plan. First and last, the ACES first and last mile technology is part of the reason the organization was created is because it has a different use case. It has a different safety profile. And so can you talk a little bit about the safety profile and how the current generation of vehicles, you know, one, compare to human-driven vehicles, and then two, how the current generation of vehicles compare to the next generation of vehicles from a safety perspective?
Yeah, no, happy to hit on that quickly. You know, one thing I'd say about the ACES Coalition, if you didn't mention this in your introduction, you know, it is led by our public sector members, and I think that's a real critical difference. Although we are a member as a private sector partner, we're in the back seat to the public sector for an important reason. We wanted this to be driven by those that are going to be utilizing these, you know, on the front line and provisioning their services, and us in support of everything that needs to be done legislatively from a regulatory perspective, safety perspective, and et cetera. But I think specific to the topic of safety, and no webinar is complete without somebody blowing grass off of your patio here. So hopefully that's not disrupting the discussion. But, you know, one of the things that we believe as a business, and I think this is being proven out in industry, and it kind of hits to this area of safety, is autonomous platforms are going to be proven out, I will use the term incrementally. It's logical that you would start in controlled environments, controlled speeds, you know, planned routes and services, and then evolve to more, you know, broad any-to-any use cases, expanded operating domains, higher speeds. And so I think in the case of these first mile, last mile services, you're typically operating, you know, in speeds of 25, 35 miles an hour or less. And so by default, you're dealing with a safer environment just by the nature of the types of services you're providing in these first mile, last mile situations. You know, then you have the area of fixed and planned routes. The technology, if it knows the area it's working within, and you are able to use, you know, AI components and the software and technology itself to continually improve your knowledge of that environment you operate within, it's going to become a higher quality of service. It's going to become more predictable, and it's ultimately going to become more safe because you're not going into new terrain. You may not travel regularly. So we believe it's really critical, and where we can have the biggest impact in focusing in these areas that are safer, that'll provide a much, you know, higher continuity of service. And as I said at the beginning, will have a big impact as far as the use cases we serve.
Great, thank you. So Matt, the next question is for you. So Joe kind of laid out some of the basic elements that have to be taken into consideration when an agency is contemplating either demonstrating or deploying this technology. From your perspective, I mean, so most of these agencies, in fact, yeah, the vast majority of these agencies do have labor unions who provide much of the work there. And so from a labor perspective, what are the kind of the essential what things does an agency need to keep in mind when they're thinking about this and they need to engage their unions to try to create a safe and an environment that an environment in which everybody's engaged and seeing the opportunity that's there?
Yeah, simple question. I think, look, I think in some ways, like the whole thing got off on sort of a bad start in general because going back to the SMART grant program at the end of the Obama administration, there was money that went out, I think, to Ohio. Part of that money was to pilot or to demo a AV shuttle, and the way it was deployed, it ran alongside an existing bus route, which for folks who know about transit labor protections, the 13C labor protections, it's a real sort of inappropriate way of having done that. And there was, I don't think there was any consultation with the unions. There was a lot of pushback, and then what ended up happening was they changed the routes to be, supplementary to existing fixed route service. I do think just on a mostly on a personal level, but to some extent on a work level, like this is a use case where I think there could be real opportunities to gain union support. I think going back to the INVEST Act, which was then Peter DeFazio's attempt to pass a surface transportation bill, we had worked, myself and one of my unions, with the staff there to allow innovative funding pot of money that would have supported these things as a eligible use of funds, as long as, in general, it would have been an eligible use of funds. The limitation we put on it was, I think, pretty minor, which was that in order to count the miles towards NTD miles, it would have to begin or end at a existing form of mass public transportation, or be second shift service that didn't already exist, new service that there was no risk of sort of replacing service by attrition. And I think in the time since, some of the other unions, like there's some division over now whether there should be any AV at all, or if so, like, how do we do this in a really smart way? So, again, I think this is like the best hook, because there's a real clear argument to make that, if you're driving passengers who might otherwise not take transit to existing forms of mass public transit and driving fare box revenue and increasing transit ridership, that is ultimately to the benefit of the transit system and the workers who service it. Where I think we run into challenges is that there are obviously, I think there's good opportunities, assuming those aren't services that are already being provided, which they're not. It's not that there's necessarily a job loss there, but there's a real opportunity to pick up jobs on the maintenance side. I think the challenges we're seeing as far as doing that practically now have been, we included money in the infrastructure bill for as part of the Low-No program to include an extra 5% for workforce training, and I think when we did that, it was labor, we felt that was a really good opportunity. And what we're finding out now is that the implementation of that is really difficult. There's workforce, there are not enough workers to meet current needs at many of these systems. Pulling workers off the line who are primarily not, they're primarily diesel mechanics, and then retraining them and finding the time to take them off the line and do that has been really difficult. I think there's perhaps not been enough coordination at the federal level on not having transit agencies reinvent the wheel here on an agency by agency basis. And then I think, one of the things we had argued for is that money should be eligible, or a use of that money should be eligible to go towards training consortia, so that we can look at regionalism or sort of creating national standards and national training programs that don't necessarily need to be developed on a case-by-case basis. The reason I bring that part up is, it is much more difficult than saying we need to train the workforce, the union workforce, to do this work. Like there are challenges with the existing capacity. There is, though, this organization, the Transportation Learning Center. It is a joint labor management led organization with both APTA and labor unions on the board. They have a really proven success record at developing workforce training standards and implementing those in ways that have actually impressive outcomes. It's not just sort of like a organization that exists to exist. They've got a really good proven record. And for the last 4 years, maybe, they've been appropriated federal funds to become the first federally supported frontline workforce training center for transit workers. There had been the money that goes towards training management, but never actual investment in the frontline workforce. So I think it's a really long way of saying, I think one of the best opportunities that people could take advantage of is looking at opportunities to demo how we might build a maintenance workforce for these vehicles that empowers the incumbent workforce and ensures that we have a future workforce to do these in-house. The consequence on the no-load side is that they're maintained with long-term maintenance warranties, and that maintenance ends up not being done in-house because they don't, they get training materials as part of the procurement, but it's a 1,000-page engineering document for electrical work, and they're diesel mechanics. So recognizing the challenge there, and I think, again, being proactive in reaching out to the unions, on the company side and then on the transit side. I think on the agency side, I think they just really need to engage in the conversation. We've had policies as simple as requiring advance notice that they're going to use a new technology and just give workers 60 days, and we've had that fought. So far as that, even in California, where it passed unanimously, the governor vetoed a bill that simply would have required notification. And I think that reflects really poorly on the transit agency's unwillingness to even engage in the conversation, let alone be actual partners in it. So, every local and every agency is different. It's hard to say universally how to do this, but I think engaging in a serious way and using first last mile as a topic and maintenance as an opportunity is maybe the best path to build union trust and support.
So Matt, there are two things a lot of things I take out of your comment, but the two things that at least resonate for me. First of all, I love I love what you're saying about not creating new workforce programs at every deployment. That just doesn't make any sense at all to me, and which is why the coalition has created a workforce development work group, and we look forward to working with you and with the Labor Management Center, because that seems like a perfect fit. The second thing that you said that I think resonates with me is these are not replacement jobs. These are additive jobs. These are new jobs and new union jobs. And they may very well be attractive to a different type of person who is doing traditional maintenance or traditional, on a diesel bus or on a LNG bus. It's a new set of skill set. It's a new skill set. And so I think it's an opportunity for the unions to, in fact, to grow their membership. And so anyways, those were the two takeaways. There is a question in the chat box for you, and it is, what kind of overlap and divergence do you see around the skills that are needed for traditional transit operated driver and those for an operator, shuttle attendant, so a safety attendant? And I don't know if you can answer that or if Joe needs to answer that, but you can take a first cut at it.
Yeah, I think you know, you know, I will say this about the driving task that exists as it, you know, currently exists with human operators. I think, we have been partnering with CMU, Carnegie Mellon, you know, as it's one thing for us to go out and say this is labor, but like, you know, obviously labor is going to have an agenda that we're pushing and substantiating this with research that, is not biased towards us on purpose, but supports our positions. That these are often very highly dynamic environments that, the driving task is very complicated. It's hard to imagine on a full-size city bus how a AV could replace a lot of what is intrinsically human, how an ADS could replace a lot of what is sort of intrinsically human about that job. In smaller vehicles, you know, I think there is maybe more of a argument that is a feasible, you know, level 4 or 5 is feasible there, in a way that's safe and enhances transit. What a lot of the job is, you know, I think people think of a bus driver. What a lot of that job ends up being is not just operating a vehicle in a very stressful, very dynamic way with many vulnerable road users, and I think our streets have just gotten crazier since, you know, gig workers have, you know, sort of proliferated, and there's cars double parked everywhere, and so there's a lot that they're navigating. I think despite that, they're customer service agents. They're enforcing ADA requirements. They are dealing with unruly passengers, and they're doing all of this while performing a job that I don't think they get enough credit for as being, both very difficult and done in perhaps, I think, the safest way, maybe the safest mode of any surface transportation vehicle on our streets. So like, they are very skilled and they're doing all this stuff on the side. I think, where our unions get a little anxious about sort of the service attendant role is, we're already dealing with, operator assault challenges in such a serious way as it is. And I think, you know, essentially converting someone from a skilled driver doing primarily, you know, physical tasks to becoming what might effectively be a security guard, but not being empowered by their transit agencies, or, you know, having difficulty with law enforcement actually enforcing violence against workers. You know, I think it creates even more opportunities for direct confrontation. Most of this violence happens because of situational confrontation, fare box enforcement, you know, preventing a fight. And if that person is tasked with doing this in a more direct way, and we still don't have sort of a regime set up that protects those workers, like, I think there are real challenges there that really need to be worked through with transit agencies, and hopefully will be with the creation of the labor management safety committees that have been established under federal law.
Joe, from your perspective, how do you see your safety operators? I mean, I think you see your safety operators in kind of a slightly different view.
Yeah, I mean, I think Matt makes some great points, and I'll comment on kind of the importance of how the technology has to evolve to take on functions that, you know, a driver may do today that aren't, you know, brake, throttle, and steering, right? Which are numerous. But you know, we view the attendants, one, in the test programs that we're in with NHTSA, they're a requirement to have on board today in these deployments. That's not the reason we have them there, but they are there to serve a purpose. One, educating the ridership. Two, taking over manual control if that's needed, and it is in some of these first generation platforms that, you know, we've been testing and utilizing. And three is to, you know, support the riders as needed. You know, today you don't have full automation of, you know, the ADA capabilities as an example, so we may still need to support, you know, the putting in the restraints for a wheelchair or a scooter as an example. So they serve an important purpose. I will say the vehicles are operating at a high level of autonomy themselves, but the attendants are a necessary kind of part of that continuous incremental process I talked about earlier. I think one of the things I'd reinforce as it relates to where we see the future of these platforms, and most specifically in the area of public transit, we believe that there will always be a human in the loop. A lot of the technology that we develop and will be incorporating in our client deployments is around, how do you identify using technology uncivil behavior, get eyes on glass, communicate with passengers. If you have an event, how do you safely pull a vehicle off the roadway? Ensure, passengers know exactly what's going on. How do you dispatch first responders if there's an issue? How do you get an incident team quickly on the, to a site if there's a requirement to do that? Another big advantage of, imagine a geofenced area in these first mile, last mile use cases, you can quickly dispatch and be on site at these types of routes, if you will, if that's required. So, it is an evolution that we are going through. This isn't going to be a flip a switch and we're there. And I think Matt makes some great points. We have been working very closely with our clients and with labor and groups like ADA to ensure that we're advancing the technology to address, those realities, that there's a lot more that happens that might need a human to intervene. And we believe a lot of that can be done virtually and remotely, and other means of obviously dispatching resources as required.
Great, thank you. Hey, Mike, so I have a two-part question for you. The first is kind of in line with the question that I asked Joe and Matt, which is, so if an agency is getting ready or is contemplating a demonstration or a deployment, from a political standpoint, what steps do they need to take to make sure that they have a path forward and that they've managed the potential pushback from people who oppose it? So that would be the first part of the question. And then the second part of the question is kind of at a national level, from a political standpoint. What is it that gets in the way of what is it right now that's in the way of getting this technology adopted? So why don't you answer the first question first on the kind of local level side? What should an agency be thinking about? What should they be doing to make sure that they don't run into political obstacles?
So it's the same thing that I would recommend an agency if they were applying for a infra grant or a mega grant or capital investment grant. You need all the stakeholders to write the letters of support. So really transparency and support on the ground level. That's why I'm really excited that Matt and Joe, like Matt is not, as I wrote down, Matt and his members are not shy, right? So we need to get that. We might not agree, but let's not bulldoze, try to say, oh, well, we don't have to talk to them because we will never get them on board. So really get them from the ground level, get the mayors, get the grass tops and grassroots, just like you're developing an infrastructure or you're building a cargo facility around an airport or a transit facility, TOD. You really need that, all the industry support, because in these projects, because they're federally funded, it's not like how much support you get, it's overcoming the opposition, right? So, people don't like to give projects that people don't, even if it's a minority. So you really you could address the concerns, or you could say, hey, we've tried, but you really need to get all that on board. It's not just implementing a technology. Technology is the new asphalt, as Tina Quigley at RTC coined. Well, I'm giving her credit. I think she coined it. So treat it like that. It's an infrastructure project. It's advancing transportation. So that's where I would go. You really have to have a proactive, and I had to say advocacy campaign, but a advocacy campaign to get this because it's new. Right? Like, and people are wary of stuff. So you need everybody on board, or as many people as possible. Same kind of thing at national. Go ahead. Got me. No, go ahead.
I mean, it's not necessarily completely political as much as it's outreach.
Yes. Yeah. It's not, I don't think it's political of like Democrat versus Republican or all that. It is outreach, getting all the stakeholders on board. That's why you see Joe going to the local unions, or JTA going to them, or CCTA, you know, those why I'm so excited about this technology is, and I'll let Matt interrupt, is it is public-private, like this is going to be publicly funded. So it's different than the trucking atmosphere or the robo-taxis. This is different because it uses public funds. Matt, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I want to add to that. I think, you know, there are transit agencies that do have good relationships with their local unions. We've seen the deployment of microtransit projects done in a way with the full support of the union because of the transparency around it and getting good contracts out of it. I think Smart TD in Los Angeles, I think, was very supportive a number of years ago when their microtransit project demo project was put into place. I think, you know, in the cases that, you know, there isn't that trust or there isn't that openness, you know, I think companies should be going to the locals directly, and to the international offices. I think, you know, one president of a union had sort of questioned me, like, I get what you're saying. You know, when I was talking about the potential value, like, I get what you're saying, but how do I sell that to my members in a sentence without sounding like I'm ultimately saying what we're doing is going to automate away your jobs? And I think that perspective is because nobody's gone and sold the vision to them. It's not, you know, insofar as I'm looking forward and seeing the potential job loss if we don't seize the opportunity to be partners in this, you know, it is a responsibility of mine to sell them on that. But it's not my responsibility to go sell it on behalf of any company or transit agency. And I do think people should, you know, consider from the top down to the locals, engage in like a real honest dialogue, because I think there's just such a distrust when, especially in labor, we have a long history of, you know, the both automating and outsourcing of manufacturing jobs through the 80s and 90s, and this promise that there would be new economic opportunity, and that new economic opportunity often was not in the communities in which it had left. And then I think we're still, you know, the current politics of today, I think, are entirely shaped by that transition, leaving these economically sort of decimated communities all over the country. I think this is an opportunity for real serious dialogue to earn the partnership of labor and build that trust. And that's not going to happen if companies aren't talking directly to the labor unions, and if transit agencies and labor and the locals don't trust each other.
Great, thank you. So Mike, what is, from a political standpoint, and this is from the big P political standpoint, what's holding this technology back? What is it that your members and the coalition have been doing to try to address this, and what needs to happen going over the next 2 years as we enter into reauthorization?
Yeah, so, you know, it's a new technology, and the number one role of government, I hate to say, is to not screw up, right? The political leadership needs to be a little proactive with new technology. And we've seen this in the aviation space with drones and air mobility. So what we need to do is to light a fire and give them support when they go forward, right? So that's building support, and that's why you need everybody rowing in the same direction. When we're going FTA, you know, if you look, DOT, they issued a Buy America on-ramp to Siemens and the high-speed rail project in California, Brightline, because labor and hell, private fortress, the Vegas community, the politicians, Secretary Buttigieg, all the way up to the White House said, all right, this is going to be good for America. How do we get it done? And we need to, now we have a template for that for Buy America, because frankly, we don't have the technology right now in America. We need to bring it to America. We do not want to use foreign manufacturing. We want to manufacture in America to Matt's job. We want to insource. And that's the perfect example. So you really need to start educating folks, because a lot of these people don't even know what a shuttle looks like, right? What's the use case? And then how do we get it done? A lot of these vehicles need to get, touched, feel, and kicked on the tires, literally, before politicians and then the political leadership of DOT kind of approve it. And that's what our coalition is doing. We got report language in the appropriations bill. And the report language is trying to build that paper trail for the next reauthorization, because this is going to be a key point in that, right? So you get DOT to issue reports, to look at it, and then you get to publicize what the findings and figure out what the problems are, address them, and go from there. So that's what the coalition is doing now, is really working from the ground floor, trying to get Matt and Greg to tell us what's wrong with those, see what we could address, see what, we agree to disagree, that get steel folks involved, because we're going to be needing a lot of steel to manufacture these movers. Get companies like Joe involved, other operators. So stuff like that is what we've been doing, and getting the appropriate language is important, because it's the first step to build that case.
Well, congratulations. That's a big deal. I really appreciate your work there. Hey, Joe, so there have been a couple of questions about kind of the diversity of use cases, and whether this is a technology, only for kind of urban settings, or is it equally applicable or applicable in a different way in rural settings?
Yeah, so I would say obviously by default, urban settings lend themselves more to where the technology is today, and more controlled geofenced use cases. By default, urban routes tend to be longer into remote areas. The technology is absolutely able to address the needs of both rural and urban scenarios. I will say though that you've got some limitations in the types of platforms that we deploy. They're intended to be more controlled speeds. So if you have to access an urban area on a 50-mile-an-hour roadway, the types of platforms that we're deploying in these particular use cases don't necessarily lend themselves to the highway type routes, if you will. So there are some limitations. All of those will be solved for over time, which is why I kind of come back to kind of the incrementalist approach to this. Begin in controlled speed environments, planned routes, geofenced areas, prove those out, advance the technology as it is advancing every day. And then ultimately you can expand the operating domains to, include all of those types of use cases.
Okay. So, I think you mentioned, you said, I think what something that's very important, and that is that there are a number of different ways to skin this cat. So purpose-built shuttles is what is really where BEEP is, but right now you're also deploying converted electric FMVSS compliant vans. And there are other companies like May Mobility, for example, that converts existing FMVSS compliant vehicles into autonomous vehicles, serving first and last mile.
Yeah, no, that's correct. And for the benefit of those listening in, and most may know this, most may not, but as it relates to autonomous platforms today, a purpose-built vehicle in the simplest of terms has no driver cockpit. It's designed to be truly autonomous inside and out. An FMVSS compliant vehicle, any other vehicle on the roadways today can be retrofit with an autonomous kit and then operate, without some of the restrictions that we have in the test programs that we're serving under, with NHTSA and DOT. So just a little bit of a nuance there for people to understand. And Scott, to your point, yes. And in fact, we've got, a program at the Jacksonville Transportation Authority which is a great example of kind of a vision for utilizing these platforms in these micro-mobility scenarios long term, and evolving from an FMVSS compliant vehicle in the next year to ultimately these purpose-built vehicles that'll be Buy America compliant and achieve a full FMVSS exemption. So that is on the way. But to your point, there are vehicles today that can address expanded use cases. I think we're honestly seeing, I think if we truly all looked in the mirror and admitted this, that, we probably got out a little bit in front of our blocking as an industry and assuming that there were going to be autonomous vehicles all over our roadway today. People projected that, 5 years ago, 8 years ago. And I think as I've tried to describe, the reality has set in that this is a walk before you run type evolution that we need to go through. And so even with FMVSS compliant vehicles and a retrofit scenario, I believe you still need to look at it in the context of, our lessons learned, which is begin in a controlled environment at a controlled speed with planned routes and services, deploy those very safely, effectively, and effectively, and then ultimately evolve to expanded ODDs. And you're seeing that even in the cases of robotaxi deployments out there, where they're now working around a city block instead of across an entire city or geography. And so, that's what I believe we're going to see. And that's frankly where the technology is going to be adopted, and having the biggest impact in the near term.
Great. And I think the one thing I would just say is that the coalition members, the public agency members, are testing all types of technology. They're not just testing a particular approach. It's really dependent upon what their specific needs are. So Mike, let me just kind of a question that will probably end up somewhat back in Joe's lap, but from a kind of a regulatory standpoint, what is it that prevents, what will it take to move from vehicles that have safety attendants on them to vehicles that are level 4 compliant and you have somebody monitoring them from a teleassist center?
Well, so NHTSA needs to approve the vehicle. So, it has to be FMVSS or get a waiver, Part 555, like what GM is trying to do and other OEMs. We're going to need approvals for that. But then when it comes to funding issues, if this is funded by the Federal Transit Administration in larger grants than just, Build or SMART or, those one-offs, competitive grants to get the technology out there, if it's going to be established, we're going to have to bake all these standards and regulations and how to fund this through the FTA definition of transit. So what is an operating expense versus capital expense? What is, who pays for what? Most urban areas, the drivers of the buses are paid for by local or fare box recovery, where the purchase of the vehicles are are usually funded by DOT and federal funds. Well, what does that mean in this new technology? You know, what we've been hearing for the last 6 to 9 months is, you know, there was a transit hearing on the Hill that Matt's colleague, Greg Regan, testified in, one of our members, MJ Maynard, testified on. And a lot of these transit regulations are written in the 1970s or 1990s, and it's not adjusted for technology. You know, like a vehicle is not just tires and transmission. There's heavy computer systems in there. So we really need to adjust for technology in those regs. So I hope gave a little more discreet answer, but then I kind of ended it with a broad kind of brushstroke.
That's okay. All right, so we have 5 minutes left, and so I want to ask just kind of a practical question, which is from each of your individual perspective. Can you provide an example of a successful deployment from your perspective and what the lessons learned were? So, and let me start with, it may be a little unfair to start with you, Matt, but let me start with you. Is there an example of a transit agency that worked really well with labor and what it in demonstrating a project, and what made that successful?
You know, I tried to track down a good example on AV, specifically on shuttles, and sort of got a little bit of wishy-washy answers back from the internationals, I think. So what I thought maybe would be a better alternative is just to maybe talk more about the microtransit example, which, you know, granted that's different. But I think when that was done, Phil Washington had been very clear and transparent with the union, what the intention was, that that he was open to, you know, negotiations that recognize that, you know, the work is different, but he still wanted to ensure they got a long contract with good pay. And I think there was a lot of mutual trust going into that, and the result was, you know, there was good, it supported good union jobs. I think what's different on the transit side, you know, is we have sort of no idea right now what the training needs exactly are going to be, and to the effect that we will have good partnerships. I think that conversation really is where the start of that should be. So you know, while I don't have like a great on AV specifically, I think I have examples where transit unions are very happy about how they fought against AVs, but as far as like good real partnerships, I think really like finding one or two transit agencies that are really eager to look not just at what's innovative about how ADS can support their system, but what is innovative about how we train our workers and recruit and retain workers. I think that could be a really incredible starting place for bringing folks around on this, and would be a good basis for building that relationship.
So there is one example that your colleague Greg mentioned at our last board meeting, or he was in the room anyways, is SportTran in Shreveport. They reached out to their local unions, and in fact got their local unions to submit letters of support for the grant application. That's just one, you know, that's a pretty big deal, and they got the SMART grant and are deploying ACES technology right now.
Really, I don't talk to my president. I should have just gone and asked him.
I'm just sharing that because it was awesome. I mean, I was thrilled. Mike, from your perspective, can you give an example of an agency that really did do all the stuff that you talked about in terms of outreach and has been successful, and what were the 2 or 3 takeaways from that?
Well, since it's new, I don't know if it's successful, but I will say JTA is doing it right. They have got everybody on board, in my opinion, and Matt's giving me a grin, but they've gotten everybody on board, including Department of Transportation, private sector, the city. They're bringing in manufacturing. Like, that's how this is going to work, right? We're creating new jobs, and manufacturing jobs, right? Like that's, where I always say President Trump and Peter DeFazio, they had nothing in common but one thing: buy America. And what Jacksonville Transportation is trying to do is doing that. And you see everybody on board trying to get to yes. We're still, everybody's saying the right things. It's still a little bit away, but like everybody is trying to get to yes, including this Department of Transportation. So I think that is being successful.
Joe, I'll give you the last word. Do you want to talk about a specific example that stands out in your mind? I mean, you've had more than 50 deployments.
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak to one kind of in the context, and certainly echo what Mike had to say as being part of the JTA U2C program. I mean, that's a little bit of the gold standard as it relates to not only what we're doing here in the U.S., but also globally. But I'll say, we've been involved in a project for over 4 years down in Lake Nona, Florida. And although it's a private development, all public road deployments, it's a great example of a public-private partnership. Out there, they've got over 15,000 jobs that have been created in that area, from healthcare to construction, at all levels of employment opportunity. And one of the services that we provide is actually an extension of the Lynx bus stops down there. In an 18 square mile area, there's 2 bus stops. And so people that may want to get to that area to access jobs didn't have any alternatives available to them. And so we were very intentional about not only providing a service, for the private sector and residents and businesses and visitors that are in that area, funded by the private sector, but now kind of in a public-private partnership, providing extended services to those that are using public transit. So we started there, almost 5 years ago now, with a single route and 2 vehicles. We've got now 8 routes and over 10 vehicles in operation. And again, first generation vehicles, and in the next couple of years are going to evolve into, industrialized platforms that are really going to enable us to expand the services we provide there and elsewhere. So a lot of exciting things on the horizon.
Great. Well, I want to thank each of you for taking the time to participate in this webinar. I think it was really excellent. And I also want to thank our sponsor, the Jacksonville Transportation Authority. JTA started this webinar series and then graciously asked us to work with them on it, and we couldn't do it without them. So, and then finally, for those of you who are in the audience, if you liked this, we will do another one in 2 months. If you like this and you want to share it with your colleagues, it will be available on YouTube and on LinkedIn in the next week or so. And I think you'd be remiss if you didn't share it, because there's an awful lot of really good information that came out of this, particularly for those agencies that are looking to demonstrate and to deploy this technology. So until, let's see, it's 2 months from now. This is July, August, September. So until September, we will see you then. And thank you again, everybody. Great job.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Recording stopped.